So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what people refer to as the Synoptic Gospels. They call them the Synoptic Gospels because they are viewed as the same optics, synoptics. So same optics. They're viewing the same thing. They're just writing down their own personal experiences. But in Luke chapter 5, verse 12, it's the story of where Jesus heals the leper. And it's important to understand that Luke, since we're viewing it from Luke's point of view, that Luke is a physician. He's a doctor. So we're going to get different words, descriptive words from him specifically, where we wouldn't get those words from Matthew or Mark. So in Luke chapter 5, verse 12, it says, "And it happened when he was in a certain city that, behold, a man who was full of leprosy saw Jesus." So it says full of leprosy. If you read the other accounts, it just says that a leper came up to Jesus. But here we are told that this man was full of leprosy, which means he was on the verge of dying. So this is a very serious ordeal. And it's interesting because we know that Jesus reaches out his hand and he touches him. And you can go on and on about how amazing that is because, and looking at it from the leper's point of view, that guy was not touched by another human since he was banished by whatever priest banished him, because back then only a priest could banish you from the people, and it was required by the lepers to walk around, and if they were around anybody else that were just passing by, they were mandated to shout out, "Unclean, unclean," just so everybody knew to run away from them. And so when Jesus goes up to him and personally touches him, that shows all kinds of emotion and how much love he actually had for this person that everybody was running away from. This man is representative of you and I, and it's just very thought-provoking when you think about that. Now, this might not seem like that big of a deal, but it was to a Jewish person. And the reason why this was a big deal to a Jewish person is because this miracle was never performed before, ever. Now, you might find that Naaman, the Syrian, he was a general, he had leprosy in the Old Testament. So you can say that would be right. But what you need to understand is that he was not a Jew. So the important distinction here is to understand that this has never occurred before to a Jew. This man that Jesus healed was a Jew, and so this sparked something in all the Jewish people's minds during this time because they've never seen this before. If you go back and if you read Leviticus chapter 14, you will see all the rituals and the requirements that were to take place when a Jewish person was healed from leprosy. The only thing is to make the connection that it's never happened before. And since it's never happened before, the Jewish people understood this to be a messianic type of miracle. And so during the time of Jesus, when he was boots on the ground at Capernaum, he healed this man and news spread like wildfire. And that's crazy because people knew what this meant. This wasn't just like another miracle, like where, like he fed the 5,000, which, is amazing. But to the Jewish mind, this is why we need to understand how Jewish people think. Because when this miracle occurred, if you go and if you read Luke chapter 5, verse 17, it says this, "Now it happened on a certain day as he was teaching that there were Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting by who had come out of every town of Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem." Now, the reason why Luke is giving us these details is because we need to understand how big this is. So if you go to John, just in comparison, in John chapter 1, verse 19, John's out and he's preaching, and it says in John 1 verse 19, it says, "Now this is the testimony of John when the Jews sent priests and the Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, 'Who are you?'" So this was when John was teaching, and so they send people from the Sanhedrin, send a couple people to go check out who this guy is who's teaching, and this was a very small scale when you compare it to John the Baptist. But when Jesus did what he did, there were religious leaders from all over the place, from the Sanhedrin, who were coming from, what did it say, Jerusalem, Judea, and Galilee, from all across the area here, that were coming to observe Jesus. And it's because they heard of the leper being healed. And so this is huge in the Jewish world. And so when they heard about this, they wanted to go and check out this guy named Jesus to see if there was anything behind what they had heard. So this was the observation stage of the Pharisees. So the Pharisees show up and they start watching Jesus from a distance. They don't say anything, but they're watching him. And so there's two stages. There was the observation stage. After the observation stage, that turned into the interrogation stage. So in Luke chapter 5, verse 22, it says, "But when Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answered and said to them, 'Why are you reasoning in your hearts?'" And so it's interesting because Jesus knew what these Pharisees were thinking, even though they didn't verbally say anything out loud. And that's significant. That's important to pay attention to. But then he goes on in verse 23, he says, "Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven you,' or say, 'Rise up and walk'?" He was using a form of rabbinic questioning, and so he was trying to guide them to the answer without giving them the answer, so that way they could learn on their own. But what we know is that he was asking which one's easier. And so the answer is, it's easier to say your sins are forgiven because there's no proof that is required. I could say that right now and I couldn't prove it. It would just be me saying something. So the harder thing to say would be rise up and walk. And so what he was essentially doing was Jesus was proving he could do the easier, the sins, by doing the harder, which was the miracle. So he actually proved it. So it's very interesting when you think about what's going on to these people and how they were thinking, and especially when you go to Luke chapter 7, verse 20, it says, "When the men had come to him, they said, 'John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?' And that very hour he cured many of infirmities, afflictions, and evil spirits, and to many blind he gave sight. Jesus answered and said to them, 'Go and tell John the things you have seen and heard, that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them.'" The reason why this is important is because Jesus was giving that message to John. John would hear that the lepers were being healed. He would correlate that back to Leviticus chapter 14 because he knows that no Jewish man has ever been healed of leprosy before. And so since this leper was being healed, this is associating him to be the Messiah. Jesus was telling John the Baptist that he was the Messiah, and it's just something that you and I don't pick up on until you dive into it. And this type of stuff is so neat, but this is why it's so important to learn how a Jewish person thinks, because we worship a Jewish God and we read a Jewish Bible. And if we remember those things, then why don't we learn how to think like a Jew? Because that will help us, and you would do well to do that. Hope this helps. Thanks, guys.